This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is July 18th, 2020. I'm producer Pat, and it's just me as we continue to record in isolation. We have two interesting segments for you today. Darren is going to give us a deep dive about Steven Pinker and a letter written to the Linguistic Society of America about him. But before that, Cristina tells us about the Oura smart ring, which has been making the news. I hope everyone out there is staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you soon.
An event reminder popped up on my phone that I haven't seen in a few months. It was from my Toronto Raptors app alerting me that the Raps will play the Lakers on August 1st. Now, for those who listen to the show regularly, you know I'm a big basketball fan, so you'd think I'd be excited by this alert. But as much as I miss watching and going to games, I'm honestly in no hurry for the season to come back this year. Unless, of course, the league can do it safely, and I have confidence in NBA Commissioner Adam Silver that the safety of the players is their top priority. Having said that, wouldn't it be great if there was some magical, ring that NBA players could wear, like jewelry, that could predict coronavirus symptoms and alert medical staff that a player may be coming down with COVID-19? A few weeks ago, Adam posted a link to a June 18 tweet from NBA Central in our group chat, which read, NBA players will wear a smart ring at Disney World per CNBC.com. The Oura smart ring is capable of predicting COVID-19 symptoms up to 3 days in advance with 90% accuracy. The ring can measure body temperature, respiratory functions, and heart rate. We were all immediately skeptical. A COVID detector? 90% accuracy. Really? My favorite reaction to this tweet was from Hayley Wickenheiser, Canadian Hockey Hall of Famer, and current Assistant Director of Player Development for the Toronto Maple Leafs, who tweeted one word: nonsense. So yes, it is true that the Oura smart ring exists and that it will be available to NBA players as the league tries to salvage the season. They sell for $300 US, about 500 Canadian. And whether the claims in the tweet can be substantiated, well, let's find out, because wouldn't that be awesome, right? A recent Forbes article by Shlomo Sprung cites the NBA purchased more than 2,000 Oura smart rings to help prevent the spread of coronavirus when the league restarts the season next month in Orlando. Now, for those who weren't aware, the league has created a bubble on Disney grounds in Florida for the players, and they obviously want to implement any method to quickly identify any player that may have the virus so they don't have to shut everything down. Enter the Oura ring, which is this sleek-looking piece of tech worn on your finger that, as the tweet says, measures your heart rate, temperature, but also sleep and quote-unquote readiness using its app. Readiness is a metric they claim can predict whether you're coming down with something. Now, Sprung explains readiness metric looks at both your sleep and activity rate over a 2-week baseline period and measures 4 key factors: heart rate variability, temperature, and respiratory rate. This data essentially combines spitting out an overall risk score. And if the risk score is elevated, the suggestion is this might be a sign you're getting sick. This device has actually been commercially available since 2016. And NBA strength and conditioning coaches and players on many teams, including the LA Clippers, Lakers, Heat, 76ers, and the Cavaliers' Kevin Love, have already been using the rings to help optimize their sleep and quote-unquote overall wellness. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal and Manu Ginobili are investors in the company, and Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey and billionaires like Michael Dell are among the fans of this wearable tech. So yeah, this ring's been around for a few years, but it seems more recent that it's being touted as a potential early detector of sickness like the flu. Sprung interviews Finnish company Oura's CEO Harpreet Singh Rai, and he tells Sprung, every flu season, every cold season, we've had users come to us and say, hey, my data was off 1 or 2 days, or even more sometimes, before I felt sick. Sounds really cool, but this is anecdotal. What do the studies behind this device say? NBA researchers relate that the Oura ring could be promising to a league committee about wearables. Yes, the NBA apparently has a wearables committee. Forbes cites the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute at West Virginia U has been studying the ring for over a year, and they say in a press release the ring could detect symptoms with 90% accuracy 3 days in advance. And that's why you're seeing that soundbite used. That's where it's coming from. As Dr. Darren Long, a clinical assistant prof at the U of Tennessee and an emergency room physician, told CNN, quote, There is not a lot of data on it right now. There have been some studies that I've seen. Most of the studies are published by the device manufacturers. Now, this is the consensus with other medical professionals that they reached out to. There just isn't solid information backing up the claims for them to even comment right now, citing the studies were also funded by the manufacturers. Now, that's not to say that just because Oura partnered with Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute, the results are bogus. They haven't been published or peer-reviewed, so it's just nothing to see here yet. Aaron Mack mentions in his Slate article what the NBA's $300 COVID detecting rings can actually accomplish. Quote, "There's no substantial proof that wearables like the Oura ring are useful for early detection and plenty of reason to be skeptical. It's also unclear whether wearables would be able to distinguish between the presence of the coronavirus or another viral infection like influenza." Good point. Now, Oura's CEO Singh Rai does tell Forbes, "We know the research isn't done, but if you can see if someone's temperature is elevated, that's really interesting, and perhaps we could test people even more." Okay, fair. But you could also do that with a thermometer, right? I do get the convenience of wearing something that's monitoring you, but the point is the Oura ring is not some panacea for the prediction of COVID-19. One of the most comprehensive articles I found breaking down the ring's claims using a scientific lens was penned by biological scientist Jonathan Jerry, science communicator at McGill's University Office for Science and Society. I cited him during my recent segment on Flushable Wife, so I think he's becoming kind of like my own Snopes. Do check out his article I linked to for more detail. It's called The Magical Ring That Was Claimed to Predict COVID-19. And as Jerry relays, technology can certainly speed up interventions, there's no question, in a pandemic. But it's a pretty exceptional claim that we can detect an infection days before symptoms show up. Quote, "I puzzled over how the superficial measurements the ring makes could even predict the symptoms of an infection. What sign buried in your body or clearly visible to a keen observer would herald the appearance of a fever a day, 2 days, 3 days in advance? The scientific literature is not very chatty on the topic of predicting fevers." Now, we know there is a lot of woo-woo in sports. Look no further than NFL star Tom Brady and the pseudoscientific nonsense his wellness brand TP12 peddles. And to be clear, the NBA isn't relying on just the Oura ring to make important decisions on players' health and safety. The league is testing each player every day, including temperature checks, pulse oximeters, and for those players who opted in on the wearable, their risk score baseline is just another tool that the NBA will look at. As an aside, some of the players like the Lakers' Kyle Kuzma have voiced concerns about the ring being more like a tracking device and an invasion of privacy, but that's a rabbit hole for another day. The takeaway here, checkers, the research is just not there to make the kind of claim in that tweet I mentioned off the top.
Hi listeners, I hope you're well. Given some recent events, I thought it important to do a segment on Steven Pinker. While I would rather talk about many interesting aspects of his work, that's not what this is. This segment will be mostly about a letter against him written to the Linguistic Society of America. Why do this segment, you ask? Well, thanks for asking. First, some contextual thoughts. I should mention that I currently believe that most people have never even heard of Steven Pinker, and I'd bet that most people have never heard of Linguistic Society of America either. If they have heard of Pinker, they probably haven't read his books, and if they have read his books, they probably don't have many issues with them. But there is a different subgroup of people who very much take issue with Pinker and criticize him and his work, and it's hard not to see these attacks on Pinker as a proxy for some of the ideas Pinker discusses. I see the letter to the Linguistic Society as an example of that, and thus worth addressing. Perhaps in the future, I'll do a broader segment on why many other people don't like Steven Pinker. So I did say most people probably don't know who Steven Pinker is, but I'm guessing most of our listeners do. Just in case, though, a quick bio from the top of the Wikipedia page. Steven Arthur Pinker is a Canadian-American cognitive scientist, linguist, and popular science author. He is Johnstone Family Professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, and is known for his advocacy of evolutionary psychology and the computational theory of mind. And I'll also add issues of language. He's won lots of awards and is highly influential. For a bit of context, I've read his books The Language Instinct, The Blank Slate, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and Enlightenment Now, a few parts of other books, numerous articles, and saw him speak once. Longtime listeners may recall that I did a long review of his book The Better Angels of Our Nature on episode 206, back when we actually had a segment that went on for 35 minutes. Also, that particular show describes Pat as a guest, which I thought was a bit amusing as one forgets the past. Adam also did a bit of a follow-up in episode 479 regarding whether violence has increased or decreased. That's who Pinker is. Next is the letter to the Linguistic Society of America, which currently has 609 names on it. It's also available in the show notes at trcpodcast.com. I won't be reading the whole letter, but here's the first chunk. This is an open letter by members of the linguistics community calling for the removal of Dr. Steven Pinker from both our list of distinguished academic fellows and our list of media experts. We, the undersigned, believe that Dr. Pinker's behavior as a public academic is not befitting of a representative of our professional organization, that the LSA's own stated goals make such a conclusion inevitable, and that the LSA should publicly reaffirm its position and distance itself from Dr. Pinker. As we demonstrate below, Dr. Pinker's behavior is systematically at odds with the LSA's recently issued statement on racial justice, which argues that, quote, listening to and respecting the experience of students of color, that's in brackets, is crucial, as is acknowledging and addressing rather than overlooking or denying the role of the discipline of linguistics in the reproduction of racism, end quote, within the letter. Still in the letter. Instead, Dr. Pinker has a history of speaking over genuine grievances and downplaying injustices, frequently by misrepresenting facts and the exact moments when black and brown people are mobilizing against systemic racism for crucial change. Though no doubt related, we set aside questions of Dr. Pinker's tendency to, and these are variously linked, move in the proximity of what The Guardian called a revival of scientific racism, his public support for David Brooks, who has argued to be a proponent of gender essentialism, his expert testimonial in favor of Jeffrey Epstein, bracket which Dr. Pinker now regrets, or his dubious past stances on rape and feminism. Letter continues, nor are we concerned with Dr. Pinker's academic contributions as a linguist, psychologist, and cognitive scientist. Instead, we aim to show here Dr. Pinker as a public figure has a pattern of drowning out the voices of people suffering from racist and sexist violence, in particular in the immediate aftermath of violent acts and or protests against the systems that created them. Below, we document 6 relevant occasions that show how Dr. Pinker's behavior is systematically and directly at odds with LSA's stated aims. We believe that these examples show that Dr. Pinker is untenable as an LSA fellow and should not be allowed to retain that status. So, fortunately, we live in a world where people have to provide at least some sort of evidence and reasons to support their views. That was just the opening salvo of the letter. I gave you about 80 or 90% of it. So, let's have a look at some of these claims. The first one, in 2015, Dr. Pinker tweeted, "Police don't shoot blacks disproportionately," linking to a New York Times article by Sendil Mulanathan. So Pinker's tweet was, "Police don't shoot blacks disproportionately. Problem, not race, but too many police shootings." And the linked article has the line, quote, "The data is unequivocal. Police killings are a race problem. African Americans are being killed disproportionately and by a wide margin." Both of the words are in italics, and that was the original emphasis. The letter says, quote, "We believe that this shows Dr. Pinker is willing to make dishonest claims in order to obfuscate the role of systemic racism and police violence," end quote. Now that seems pretty damning. Pinker says this is an issue. He links to an article that seems to say the opposite. Until you read the linked article where the very next line in the same paragraph says, quote, "and police bias may be responsible. But this data does not prove that biased police officers are more likely to shoot blacks in any given encounter," end quote. Then 1 to 2 paragraphs later, quote, "For the entire country, 28.9% of arrestees were African American. This number is not very different from the 31.8% of police shooting victims who were African Americans. If police discrimination were a big factor in the actual killings, we would have expected a larger gap between the arrest rate and the police killing rate. This in turn suggests that removing police racial bias will have little effect on the killing rate," end quote. So usually people put their strongest argument first. It was only a couple months ago that I learned that race doesn't seem to have a large effect in U.S. police shootings. And here Pinker knew this 5 years ago. Was his tweet imperfect because of the ambiguity of the word disproportionately? Yes. But given it is a group of linguists, one would have hoped someone would have cared about whether Pinker meant according to population or according to crime rate or encounters with police. This seems like a great opportunity to look at the nature of language by a bunch of linguists. So as the opening piece of evidence, that falls completely flat. Unfortunately for all the signatories, it doesn't get that much better. Going pretty high level here, the next point is an uncharitable interpretation of saying what kind of lives matter. The third is picking one sentence out of a long paragraph to imply that Pinker thinks killers are nice people. The fourth, though, has at least something to it, so we'll spend some time on that. The letter says, this is quote, "In 2014, a student murdered 6 women at UC Santa Barbara after posting a video online that detailed his misogynistic reasons. Ignoring the perpetrator's own hate speech, Dr. Pinker called the idea that such a murder could be part of a sexist pattern, quote, statistically obtuse. once again undermining those who stand up against violence while downplaying the actual murder of 6 women as well as systems of misogyny. That's their statement. Now, Pinker's tweet is, quote, "The idea that the USCB murders are part of a pattern of hatred against women is statistically obtuse," with a link that doesn't work. Now, Jerry Coyne also has analyzed this Linguistic Society of America letter and has a personal connection to Pinker, and he was able to follow up. So Coyne, from his blog, quote, "I couldn't find the statistically obtuse link, asked Steve about it, and he didn't remember it either. But his point was clearly not to say that the murder wasn't motivated by hatred of women, but to question whether it was part of a general pattern of hatred of women. That's a different issue. I'll quote Steve again with his permission." Now, this is a quote. Jerry's quoting Steve now, and I'm quoting him. "I don't remember what it initially pointed to, but I've often argued that reading social trends into rampage shootings and suicide terrorists is statistically obtuse and politically harmful. It's obtuse because vastly more people are killed in day-to-day homicides, to say nothing of accidents. News watchers who think they are common are victims of the availability bias, mistaking saturation media coverage of horrific, isolated events for major social trends. Every victim of a murder is an unspeakable tragedy, but in trying to reduce violence, we should focus foremost on the phenomena that harms people in the largest numbers. It's possible, I don't remember, that I mentioned data showing that Uroxicide, the killing of women by husbands and romantic partners, has been in decline. Focusing on rampage shooters and suicide terrorists is harmful because it gives these embittered losers exactly what they're seeking, notoriety and political importance, thereby incentivizing more of them. Also, the overreaction to these two smaller kinds of violence can have dangerous side effects, from traumatizing school children with pointless active shooter drills to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. The legal scholar Adam Langford is the one who's written most compellingly about the drive of rampage shooters to make a difference, if only posthumously, a good reason not to grant undue importance to their vile final acts. I'll leave it for listeners to decide if Pinker is guilty of those accusations. The 5th point in the letter says, quote, "On June 3rd, 2020, during historic Black Lives Matter protests in response to violent racist killings by police of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others, Dr. Pinker chose to publicly co-opt the academic work of a black social scientist to further his deflationary agenda. He misrepresents the work of that scholar, who himself mainly expressed the hope he felt that the protest might spark genuine change in keeping with his belief in the ultimate goodness of humanity." This was Pinker's tweet. Quote, "Harvard social science Dean Lawrence Bobo did the research I've cited on the decline of overt racism in the United States. Here he reflects, with cautious optimism, on race relations in the context of police killings of black men." And then a link. So what's going on here? What does Bobo's research say? And both the letter against Pinker and Pinker say Bobo was hopeful, but was he, and about what? Well, Pinker provides Coyne with 3 specific citations from Bobo that overt racism has declined in the US from 1997, 2001, 2009. So that seems to be research that Bobo does. The linked article has Bobo saying, "On the one hand, I am greatly heartened by the level of mobilization and civil protests that has touched so many people and brought out so many tens of thousands of individuals to express their concern, their outrage, their condemnation of the police actions in this case, and their demand for change and justice. I find all that greatly encouraging. It is, at the same moment, very disappointing that some folks have taken this as an opportunity to try to bring chaos and violence to these occasions of otherwise high-minded civil protest. And I'm disappointed by those occasions where, in law enforcement, individuals and agencies have acted in ways that have provoked or antagonized otherwise peaceful protest actions." This seems like general support for the protests, with some caveats, and so it could be mixed in some ways. As for why he's hopeful, I can see validity on both sides of this, depending on if you read what he said, but that phrase, co-opted, that seems like intentionally inflammatory framing. So people who do research often want other people to know about their research, and if a prominent person mentions their research, that's usually good, and that seems to be what Pinker did. So if you try to imagine an adjacent world where Pinker is actually applauded and lauded for boosting the visibility of a black researcher, that's not what happened here, or a different one where he doesn't actually tweet any of this, but then later is accused of not boosting black researchers enough. I think this is entirely plausible of what might happen in this world. Now, the timing one could question. It was June 3rd. Obviously, these are very historic protests, but that doesn't mean that you can't talk about interesting ideas at a time when it's on everyone's mind. I know everyone wants to move in lockstep on these things, but having more data and analysis of what's going on in the world so people better understand the world seems useful, even if it's at a time when other people don't want to hear anything about it. Now, the final point of the 6 is about whether the word urban in urban crime is a dog whistle and Pinker is some sort of racist. But it turns out people who study urban crime refer to it as urban crime. They're not secretly talking about black people and minorities, so I think that's not that big a deal. So there are 6 problems that they list. 5 tweets, and 1 sentence in a really long book, none of which seem to be much of an issue when analyzed, with a small amount of rigor and fairness. While there is more absurdity in the end of the letter, I'm not going to describe it, but I did want to go back to the top, with the line in the letter saying his expert testimonial in favor of Jeffrey Epstein, which Dr. Pinker now regrets. I think this is worth addressing because it keeps coming up in various places. Pinker's Wikipedia page has a decent summary of what I believe to be true. This is, quote, "In 2007, Pinker lent assistance to Jeffrey Epstein's criminal defense by providing his interpretation of the wording of a federal law that prosecutors claimed Epstein had violated. The charge against Epstein was that he had violated the law by using the internet to persuade minors to engage in prostitution. In 2019, Pinker stated that he was unaware that his expert interpretation of the wording of the law had been used to defend Epstein, and claimed that his goal was to execute a favor for Alan Dershowitz, a colleague of Pinker's and a former attorney for Epstein. I believe the case is that they're both at Harvard, Pinker and Dershowitz. Sometimes Dershowitz, a famous lawyer, would ask Pinker, a famous linguist, what do you think this word means? So a colleague who is a lawyer is asking you for linguistic advice, and then you later find out that was used to defend someone, is very different than the framing expert testimonial in favor of. It's not like he recorded a video, appeared in court defending Jeffrey Epstein. It was asked, what do these words mean? Out of context, and he said, well, I think this is what they mean. And later he found out how it was used, and then he regrets it. There are also photos of Pinker and Epstein, I think 2 on the internet, even though Pinker says he doesn't know him and found him annoying. Why would this be? Well, many people in the fancy world of academics, politics, and everything else go to these fancy events, and people take photos of high-profile people. This seems nothing like a clear case of trying to use guilt by association to impugn Pinker's character. And especially when you go back to the initial opening words of that letter, I just think it's poor. So try to remember this part from the beginning of the letter. Though no doubt related, we set aside questions of Dr. Pinker's tendency to move in the proximity of what the Guardian called a revival of scientific racism. What is this phrase? To move in the proximity of something that somewhere else called something bad. Oh, that's a lot of links. His public support for David Brooks, who has been argued to be a proponent of. So he has supported someone who other people have argued is a proponent of something supposedly bad. And then the Epstein thing. This is guilt by association, to say the least, but it sounds like guilt by association by implied association, and that seems even more weak and frustrating. Now, I'm not saying, it's not related that he hangs around with a bunch of Nazis. I'm just saying that he kind of does. Yes, Goodwin's Law, and I mentioned Nazis there, but I think it shows how absurd it is when you just try to imply someone's bad because of the people they hang around, even if it's not even true in the first place whatsoever. I think it's hard to see this letter against Pinker as anything but malicious deception by people who just don't like Pinker. But, trying to be somewhat charitable, perhaps it is just staggeringly biased cherry picking and then ignorance by others who have signed it. The recent issuance of that letter about supporting these recent protests and events by the Linguistic Society of America might have had some specific language, and then these tweets seem to go against that specific language. Though some of them are, from 5, 6, 7 years ago, it doesn't seem to matter whether they're accurate or truthful or factual, but people just didn't seem to like it, and then many signed. So the final part of my segment is to hear from 2 linguists. The first is from a post on Medium by Barbara Party, who is A, a famous linguist, B, an inaugural fellow of the Linguistic Society of America, and C, a former president of the LSA. So she has at least some understanding of the community and the organization. What does she have to say? And this is an excerpt. Quote, I was shocked and surprised when I learned of this petition, since in my own experience, Steven Pinker works hard for racial justice. Steve and I have been working together in the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to help increase the number of black linguists and women in these academies. He's been playing a leading role in these efforts. I have no doubts about his commitment to social justice. Others who know him better than I do would probably be able to cite more of his work in advocacy and mentoring. The complaints in the petition seem related to the positions he has taken in his books, positions about progress which are controversial but sincerely held and backed by arguments that may be imperfect but should be answered with other arguments, not with censure in my opinion. It's not clear whether those petitioners have read any of these books. She then mentions 2 famous names on the petition, didn't actually sign the letters, but the names were put there without their knowledge, so that's not really good for the rigor of what this petition is, and goes through each of the 6 points and concludes, Pinker, quote, has done nothing that is inconsistent with the LSA's principles. So do we trust her? Well, do we trust anyone, right? She has worked with Pinker supposedly on issues of trying to improve the well-being of minority and women people in the linguistics community. It seems like that's actual frontline work more than just being concerned about what he tweets about and saying none of this holds up. The other linguist, Noam Chomsky, maybe you've heard of him, the foundational figure in linguistics at the moment, he wouldn't sign the letter either. And he just happened to mention, I saw it, and I explained why I wouldn't sign. It's a group of students. It is indeed very much like what we've been talking about. Way out at the margin, but meat for the right, which has always supported quote-unquote cancel culture, suppression of talks and publication, violent disruption of meetings, and much more, as long as it was directed against the left, and is now pretending to be outraged as the wrong ox is gored. So obviously that's part of a conversation, but Chomsky's main point is that I don't think it's worth signing, it doesn't have much legitimacy, I don't think it helps the cause at all, and in fact is further fractious and doesn't help what we're trying to achieve. So in summation, it is concerning that 600 people would sign a letter that is so bereft of solid arguments and evidence for the position that they are advocating. The fact that many are students perhaps provides greater understanding of the situation, but it's not that reassuring. I hope people are willing to actually analyze the arguments and look at the balance of evidence, but I fear it is very difficult to open such closed minds. I guess we shall see. Until next time, think better to act better.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter @TRC_podcast.